Sofía Duarte holds a degree in modern languages and their literatures and a master's degree in advanced English studies from the University of Valencia. She completed her PhD at the same institution in 2024 with a dissertation titled Non-Human Animals in Margaret Atwood's Fictional Worlds, where she applied the interdisciplinary field of critical animal studies to analyze Margaret Atwood's novels and the presence of non-human animals within them. And she has come to present us on Being a Good Dog, Subjecthood and Representation in Ben Leonberg's Good Boy. So whenever you want, Sofia, the floor is yours.
Okay. Can you see the screen? It changes everything.
Everything's fine. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for that presentation. And I would also like to thank you and everyone in the organizing committee for giving us again this opportunity to present our research and learn some more from each other. And again, I wish I could have gone just like Francisco said. I learned so much in the first edition. So hopefully the third one, we will all be able to go there. And well, as you mentioned, I will be talking today about a film titled Good Boy. It's a horror film, so it changes drastically what we've been talking about in this panel. But again, in this case, I want to highlight how the film attempts to give subjecthood to the representation of a non-human animal and how that is achieved through the protagonist, Indy, who we can see on the screen. Especially given that it's a horror film, and as I will discuss now, horror films do not have the best reputation regarding how non-human animals are represented. So I will go directly into discussing how non-human animals have been depicted in films. Now, they have been a fundamental part of culture and are deeply embedded in how humans attempt to make sense of the world through all artistic expressions. But specifically within the field of films, we cannot think of how cinema has progressed without first of all thinking of The Horse in Motion and Sallie Gardner's how that simple step changed the presence of human animals within cinema forever, and how it has often led to groundbreaking modifications within the world of cinema, the way their stories are represented in the big screen. That being said, it is also true that they're often overlooked, and how this representation is done has also often affected how they're perceived in the collective imagination. More often than not, we find that non-human animals are simply part of the landscape or a medium through which the arc of the human character is achieved and it's developed. I'm going to quote Malamud, who says that non-human animals are thickly embedded in human culture simply because people are so interested in them. And the representation is at the service of our own cultural drives, desires, fantasies, and obsessions. In a similar way, De Mello argues that their representation can be understood as a way of understanding the cultural connections that we have amongst non-human animals and how those constructions are historically and culturally contingent. So non-human animals are a big part of the history of cinema, and we can see I've just placed a few examples on the screen how they have been both influential within the fictional world but also within the real world. Different generations have grown up alongside these heroic dogs, and it has reflected how humans see them and what the relationship is like. However, I do want to highlight that the cinema is not only mainly a visual art form, but it's also deeply anthropocentric because of this. The representation that we have of non-human animals is what De Mello states as what we know of animals is just a story that humans have made up and of them and of ourselves. So we don't really get to know them as they are. In a similar way, Parkinson argues that popular media content is created by and for humans and utilizes human framework, whether it is ideologically, discursive, economically, and so on. So it is always human centered. Dogs, such as the ones that we have here in the screen, have been socially constructed, and although they do become stars of their own in their respective films, they're ultimately what Molloy conceives as cultural constructions, concealing the non-human and their individuality and needs. That being said, I do want to highlight that Burt, for example, defends that the position of the animal as a visual object is a key component in structuring the human responses towards animals in general, particularly that of emotions. And this, I would argue that while it can be deeply problematic, as we will see in the following slide, it could also be a way of highlighting the relationships that exist between humans and non-human animals, and this could pave the way for a deeper understanding and even as a debate regarding animal rights, how we can better companions to them. So this is where Good Boy comes in, as in this case, Indy, who is the protagonist, is not a stand-in for humans or anything of an exceptional dog. He's simply a dog, a companion animal, and he's a family member whose well-being is just as important as that of the humans who make up the family. Now, before going into the film, I do want to briefly review non-human animals in horror films. We've all grown up with different types of horror films that have shaped us, and they have also shaped how we perceive non-human animals. Particularly, the best example we've always mentioned is Jaws, and it was a turning point for sharks, and it still continues to affect how we perceive them. And this is also a common factor amongst other films. Now, I've taken the concept of horror in a very widespread meaning, as you can see, because there's a lot of variety. And this is also why it's so important to look at horror films, because in a way, there's so many different genres without the horror that it allows us for a wider discussion of how they're represented. We have, for example, those that are considered eco horror, where nature is the one that runs amok. And in this case, for example, in Good Boy, it is the other way. It's the human who becomes a threat to the non-human animals. Jaws and other B horror movies like Beaver and all the Sharknadoes and so on, we have non-human animals as the antagonist. And in the case of the wild animals, they are often portrayed as horror and as a source of despair amongst humans. And as DeMello argues, companion animals such as dogs, who are considered the most loyal of animals, they turn rogue and attack animals or even humans. In this case, Good Boy, the roles are a turnaround, as I will show, and it is the human and the spectrum, the entity, who become the threats, who become a danger for Indy. Also, horror films tend to depict the social and cultural anxieties that one might feel, and I would argue that Good Boy does seem to bring this into the film, given that it represents how illnesses, whether it's mental health or more physical ones, can deeply affect those closest to us, not only ourselves, but non human animals as well. So I would argue that the film Good Boy is going to be of particular interest because it depicts how non human animals are witnesses to our suffering and how they attempt to protect us, and how their perception, how their perspective can also be a way of discussing new ways of understanding our bonds between us. So, if we place the focus on Good Boy in the film, um, I want to begin by stating that Burt points out that animals appear with greater or lesser significance in all genres of moving films throughout its history. So, what is it exactly that makes Good Boy different from all the ones that we've seen previously? Well, to begin with, Good Boy was directed by Ben Leonberg and released in 2025, and it is a horror film that has Indy as the protagonist. Now, who is exactly Indy? Well, Indy is a Nova Scotia dog tolling retriever, who we can see here covered in a blanket. And he is the protagonist. And as we can read here, the plot, it says the film follows Indy as he attempts to rescue his owner, a young man with a chronic lung disease, who is engulfed by a supernatural presence lurking in his late grandfather's rural home. So as the film progresses, the audience is only aware of what is happening through the perspective of Indy. So What's particularly groundbreaking is that the film is shot through the perspective of Indy at his height, as I will show in the following slides, screenshots of the film. And the non-human is the focus of the film, and we see him as an individual who is a subject of his own. And I particularly like this poster that I've placed here because it says, "Trust his instincts." Now we know in English it's often the case where non-human animals are referred to as it. So simply by using this pronoun, it already gives him an identity, gives him a subjecthood. So besides that, the concept here of actor, when regarding to Indy, is of particular interest because Leonberg, who is the director, is also Indy's human companion in real life, and he insists that Indy is not a trained dog, that he simply learned some tricks for the film, but that's it. Now, this is a low budget film where Indy stars in it and he plays himself throughout the film. But the characters that we see in the film, there are only actually two humans, or well, one human and one not so much. And these are played by Ben Leonberg, so Indy's human, and also his wife. So this is all done within the family, and that's why he considers it a fun family project. And basically, the reason why doing this film, he states, and I quote, Indy would stare at them like Jack Nicholson in The Shining during lunchtime. And he adds that, and I quote, anyone who has a pet has wondered or maybe worried why their dog was barking at nothing or staring at empty corners. And this is what they wanted to explore in the film. So we see the supernatural presence, sorry, possesses Indy's human and turns him against Indy, switching the common trope of the companion animal being the one who turns against the human. And while Indy is not threatened by this, he's the one that remains himself while trying to protect his human. And I will make a spoiler now. Do not worry, Indy does not die, which again, this is a difference within most of the horror films where the non-human animal is murdered or greatly harmed. So this is not the case. So how exactly does it defy horror and anthropocentrism conventions? Well, throughout the film, Indy is giving subjecthood, but also outside of it, as we can see here, Indy stars as himself, so his real name and his actor name are both the same. And as I mentioned before, the film is shot at Indy's level. We're continually seeing at the dog's island, and the audience never sees a human above their shoulders. So, and one of the particularly interesting things about the film is what is known as the Kuleshov effect, which, and I quote, it describes what happens in the audience imagination when they see two shots in the movie back to back. So most of the creativity of the film and how it manages to engage the audience and believe what is happening is through these technique. And it allows one to believe that Indy's looking scared, and it makes you feel scared for him. But in reality, none of this is happening. Indy is simply playing around. In fact, the film was shot within their home to ensure that Indy felt safe. And I'm going to pass through different pictures so that you can see how the film mostly looks like and how it is shown and recorded through his perspective. So we can see here, for example, how Indy's gaze is constant throughout the film, and this creates a sense of empathy towards him and the sense of not being able to tell his human what is happening. We feel his despair as the audience. And for example, throughout the film, we hear Indy barking or even screaming, but these are all parts of simply editing. Most of the time, in several interviews, Leonberg has been asked, and were simply Indy playing around. Which, if you have a dog, I'm sure you know that sometimes they sound like they're being murdered and they're just playing around. So all of this is done through editing. In no point was Indy pressured into doing any of the movements or the stunts that were needed. And one of the key things about the film is also that it only lasts an hour and 12 minutes, which is quite a short runtime. And this is quite interesting because we see that some of the critics have said that it was too long. But perhaps this is what makes it interesting because, as Malamud states, animals are often disguised because the authentic animal seems to be too depressing, too scary, or too boring for the viewer. And here in the film, we see how Indy sometimes is simply sleeping, other times he's walking around the house, discovering what is going on. So we see a dog acting as a dog as he would in a normal situation. Again, the film, as you can see, is shot mostly through the level of Indy, and at no point was he forced. Also, they wanted to make sure that Indy felt at ease, and this was done through having his humans always be there. Also, for example, there's a scene where we see blood, and was made sure that it was made with a dog safe food. Also, for example, the yelps, as I mentioned, were recordings of him playfully playing around. And maybe some of the times that we see him, looking straight at the camera, he was simply staring at a tennis ball or even a treat. So part of the beauty of the film is letting Indy act as a dog, simply play around the house. And this, we can see that the whole film was made to make sure that Indy felt at ease. At no time was he pressured. So for example, they comment how he would inspect everything that was taking place in the house, the gadgets that they would use. And we also see him acting naturally because, for example, in one of the scenes, we see the human waking up and Indy playing around with him. And Leonberg states that this is what Indy normally does. So we get to through this technique, Leonberg captures the essence of Indy, of how he would act in a normal situation. And as he states, they were real slices of life. So we are witnesses to this. Now I'm going to hurry quickly because I know I'm running out of time. Here we can see the ending credits, and we have the first one who's credited is Indy, staring at himself, and then we have the rest of the humans. Now, very quickly regarding the ethical considerations of having a film made like this, is that, as Malamud argues, animals do not choose to participate in our racial culture. So how is it that we can include them in an ethical way? Well, as I've mentioned before, we need to switch the anthropocentric perspective. In this case, for example, granting Indy complete protagonism with little to no human voices, simply listening to what Indy's saying in his own way. I would also add that we should see how these is represented, how Indy is represented as a subject of a life, as Regan calls them. And we see him that he has his own beliefs, his own needs, that he attempts to protect his human, but also he looks out for himself and makes decisions according to what is happening. As we have seen in some of the other films that I mentioned before, their dogs are merely little more than a character, and they're easily replaceable. And this is one of the things that was different with Good Boy. Indy did all the acting, if we want to call it that way. The only moment they used a plushie was in a scene that was too difficult for him. And for example, they spent almost a year trying to edit the last 10 minutes of the film simply because they wanted to make sure that Indy felt comfortable with what's happening. So Leonberg states that the movie was not so much about making it for them, but making a movie around what Indy needed, what he decided to do. So in this case, we see that the focal point is on Indy and not so much on the humans. And as I mentioned, we get to see him acting as he would normally when he wakes up or when he goes to sleep. The body performances were carried out by his human companions, so that made him feel at ease at all times. And even he got the film has received several awards, including the PETA Good Boy Great Filmmaking, because of this treatment, of this ethical treatment towards non-human animals. Now, to conclude, we can see here one of the comments regarding Indy. Now, this film is not going to be life-changing, but I do think that this type of film, and it shows us an alternative way of understanding how non-human animals perceive the world in an anthropocentric medium, that's visual media is. But we are placing, in this case, the needs of the non-human animals before everything else, regardless of if this meant spending more time during the film, more economic ways to do so. And the film distances itself from the anthropocentric perspective by placing the focus on dogs and how he understands what is happening. So the focus of the film within and outside of the film is on Indy and his well-being, and that even if that meant having to rewrite the scenes. So I think that this type of film could also open the debate on how to represent non-human animals through their subjecthood, but also ethically. And I do want to finish with Malamud's very briefly his quotation, as I think this type of film allows us to create a bigger debate and mainly it raises questions such as Malamud states, the type of content tokens that a film creates, what are the consequences are of this type of films, and how, and I quote directly, how might we look at them more intelligently, more fairly. So I encourage anyone who likes horror films to watch Good Boy and open up the debate of how we can represent non-human animals in a more ethical way. And that is all.